cash to set this up or maintain this, but it covers some of the fundamental building blocks that companies put in place to build a sustainable culture of measurement. And again, not one that is a single analytics project off somebody's desk at 5 p.m. on a Friday night, but it's a culture in which HR is asking questions about how do we test that idea with data? How do we build a root cause analysis? How do we look at programs in a different light than the way that we've done before? And so what I'm going to do in the next 50 minutes is go through these 9 basic decisions, which hopefully as you go into the other presentations starting this afternoon, you'll have a chance to think through how did these companies make those decisions? What were the trade-offs they made between having a generalist staff do this work versus building a center of excellence? What's their mission for workforce analytics, and how do they communicate that around the firm? So as you think through what we're going to talk about now, I'd love to see you raise questions over the next 2 days of the practitioners and the other vendors in terms of how they put together their kind of program. This for us really encapsulates what many organizations are trying to do with workforce planning and analytics. It's a maturity model. And it follows on, in many cases, from how HR is looking to become more of a business partner. It's a very simplistic diagram, but it's often used really to help understand where are we today and where do we want to be in the next 6, 12, and 18 months. So looking on the left-hand side where we may be doing some basic but consistent workforce reporting, many HR organizations are in the service provider role. They're responding to some ad hoc requests. We may be doing some very simple kind of reporting, but there's no standardization around the work that we do. Everybody gets different numbers with different formulas, different metrics, different takeaways. And we're not helping ourselves in building a solid platform for workforce reporting. From there, organizations move one step to the right, where they become more of a business enabler, where we're looking now to build some consistency. Let's all have the same formula for headcount or for turnover rate. And let's find ways in which we can push the data out in a more consistent format. So employee self-service, manager self-service, portals, other technology investments that are being made to help facilitate the delivery of those reports from an HRIS system or a spreadsheet into people's hands. Moving further to the right-hand side, we see the business partner and the business driver. And this is where we start to see data being used much more consistently around HR and beyond. We're getting into root cause analysis. We're doing modeling potentially. We're doing a lot more segmentation. So we're not looking at turnover rate for the entire company, but we're looking at regrettable or non-regrettable, at key talent versus non-key talent, mentors versus non-mentors, whatever the ways in which you might segment your workforce. That's where we're starting to get into the why is this happening and what will it mean for the future. And then finally on the far right-hand side here, business driver, where data is an accepted way in which we do business. Those firms that I talked about at the very beginning that have a core competency in this, the Dows, the WellPoints, the Sanofis, the Googles, firms that say in every way that we do people management, we're going to bring data into the equation. And so for me, we see a real cleave down the middle of this diagram. On the left-hand side, it's often about data efficiency. How quickly and easily can we get data out to people who need it? It's a bit of a scattershot approach, potentially, but it helps us decrease the cost of using the information. So on the left-hand side, data efficiency. Right-hand side, data effectiveness. Who needs this data? Why do they need it? And what will they do with it? It may mean that, as Darren has talked about, we cut back on some of the reports that we push out and say we don't have time to publish 60 or 70 reports a week. Let's just find the 1 or 2 that really do make a difference and make sure those reports have the insights and the story and the plot that are going to help somebody make a decision. So data efficiency on the left-hand side to data effectiveness on the right-hand side. The second way I see a cleave here is left-hand side is often about the technology itself. Business intelligence, data warehouses, portals, other ways of either bringing together data or then sharing it with others. The right-hand side for me is about skill sets. It's about people asking the right kinds of questions. If you think workforce analytics is a piece of technology where you just flick on the switch and boom, it gives you the answer, it's unlikely to happen. We need people to structure the analysis, ask the right kinds of questions, share and discuss the results, and then drive towards some kind of action. So those firms that are building that core competency as they move towards the right-hand side are investing heavily in building the skills and capabilities of the staff involved in the project. and really spending a lot of time understanding where can we be most effective. And in some cases, we have to make trade-offs. And I'll show some examples of it later of how we make those kinds of trade-offs for all the different requests that come in. Quick show of hands, as you look at this model from the service provider on the left-hand side, very inconsistent, very ad hoc, to something more like the business driver, business partner on the right-hand side, in terms of using data consistently, having good formulas, having good skills, where would you place yourself? How many folks would say you're in bucket one, you're the service provider, we just maybe get some data out there, we're getting some requests, but there's no consistent way of doing this? About 3 people. How about bucket number 2? Investing a lot in technologies to help the delivery of information to employees. We have some consistent formulas for our metrics, some basic reports that everybody gets. Folks in bucket 2? Just a couple. So it means probably most folks are heading towards this right-hand side. So a large part of the way that we think about this rollout planning process, this idea about making a set of decisions that lead up to the launch of a program, are really designed to understand where are we in this life cycle and what's going to help us move from one bucket to the next bucket. And we see a real path. We work with a lot of organizations who start this journey, who build some momentum from the very basics. We need more metrics, we need more data. They start to build momentum with this journey. But there's often a critical point in the journey itself at which you can make or break the program, at least for the short term. And it's really based on the kinds of decisions that are being made. And I'll read out the ones that are actually here in green that may be a little bit harder to see. We've identified our data producers. We know who's going to produce the data and how they're going to get it from system A to consumer B. We've trained them in the tools and the skill sets they need to be effective. We've changed the way that other HR staff who support this process do their work. Again, we don't expect that everybody in HR is suddenly going to drop all those mission-critical activities and become a workforce analytics expert. But are there elements in which the workforce analyst may go and talk to recruiting, or talk to employee relations, or talk to people involved in employee engagement, and change the kind of conversation? So not just the people themselves and the jobs they do, but the network beyond that. Are we changing the way in which the organization uses data? People actually start to use the information. What are the decisions that were changed because we had new information? We didn't go off some gut-based feeling. What we see, on the other hand, is that nothing changes. That this is a pet project of somebody deep in the organization. That there's no network building, there's no momentum building. Any quick wins that may have been maintained have been lost. And by the end of the day, what often comes up at the end of the year, which is, what's the ROI of this? What are we doing? I remember we launched some workforce analytics program last year. That person left. What happened to this program? So as part of this rollout planning process, we're looking to make this sustainable. It's not key person dependent. It has a clear set of goals associated with it. So when we ultimately come to launch and communicate the value of the program, we know exactly what the next 6 to 12 months will look like. So we have some great stories. We build this really good program. And then boom, we make the presentation. Anybody done a data presentation for HR where you may have had this kind of reaction? No hands up. Actually, everybody, put your hands down. People say, I don't know why I'm here, this is too much information, you've given me a massive Excel file with 60 different cells, what should I be looking at here? My finance team gives me other data, or some random guy gave me information. I don't know why I'm here. I'm not a people manager, I'm a business manager. Why do I care about turnover rates? What time is lunch and who's bringing it in? I did a presentation a couple of years ago, one of my clients, we put together this really detailed cost of turnover analysis. So we looked at their cost of turnover by all their different major segments. And we used both direct costs and some indirect costs. And we created a number of scenarios. So if the costs continue today in the current form, what will that be in 2 years' time? Versus scenario 2, scenario 3, if costs go up or costs go down. And we had some really detailed charts. It was great stuff. We got some really smart people on our team. And we sat down and we talked about the charts, and no one understood what the charts were saying. And frankly, I didn't understand either. And so, Darren knows. And so this was a 1-hour meeting. So 30 minutes in, we stopped talking about what's the cost of turnover? Why is it increasing for some of your critical talent? What we talked about were the merits of bar charts versus scatter plots. And do you put labels on the charts? And all of this. I mean, we completely lost the audience. It was a very good lesson to me in terms of we needed to make some better decisions coming into that meeting to help prep the audience. But overall, this can't happen overnight. Because if I've done this for a couple of years and had that experience, imagine someone who's doing this for the very first time, their very first presentation. They walk into that meeting and have the same kind of problems. It's almost impossible to recover from that kind of situation. And so as we think about putting some parameters around this and kind of building a foundation, it's not going to happen overnight. There have to be steps that take place, but we've seen enough from our members to say it's worthwhile spending the time before we go to market or before we make a major investment, deciding how we're going to do this. So we'll go through these steps in a bit more detail, but one firm had a very clear, very simple mission statement. It's a 30-second elevator speech. It goes into all their emails, it goes on all their documents. Everybody knows why they're doing workforce analytics. Another firm created a center of excellence. Michelle Deneau, who's from Intuit, is going to talk about that, I think, later today. But creating a center of excellence, a defined model for doing this kind of work, versus saying to the HR staff, you need to do more analysis, which is, frankly, it's not going to happen. One company offering classes to the staff. You may not be involved in managing data, but you may see some reports coming your way. What should you do with those reports? What do they mean? What kinds of questions should you be asking about the data? Very much in the same way a finance person asks questions about financial statements. And to Darren's point about the 100 critical questions, let's have workshops around this. Let's ask questions about what are the biggest risks that we face, and then put in place some metrics and KPIs to be able to do this. It's often not glamorous stuff. It's not the great predictive model that tells us how we're going to make $200 million more every year. Those happen, absolutely. But if we want to create a sustainable culture of analytics, there's a set of steps we have to take to begin with that kind of work. So here are the 9 steps. This is the cheat sheet. These are the kinds of decisions organizations make, again, aside from the financial investment side of how we're going to get the money to do this. But what's our mission for all of this? Who are our stakeholders? Who are the champions, the people in non-formal roles who are going to support this initiative? They may be inside of HR, they're probably going to be outside of HR, but who are the people who are going to help us build some momentum? What are we going to look at? How do we prioritize some of those issues? When do we share this information? We'll talk a little bit more about meetings. I can't imagine you want to have more meetings that are around data. So what are the existing meetings that are taking place today, where we can start to infuse workforce reports and workforce analytics and questions about the workforce that are already on the books? What's the model we're going to employ for this? Who's going to produce the data, that is, get it out of the system and get it into someone's hands? Who's going to consume the information? How are they going to consume it? How do they like to see the numbers? What's the communication plan for all of this? What are the different vehicles, people, messages we're going to use to broadcast awareness for workforce analytics? And then how do we measure success? At the end of the year, we want an iron-proof, bullet-clad case for why we need to continue the investment in workforce analytics. The first year is always the hardest year. If we can get through the first year, build momentum, show the quick wins, we can then continue to build the program. So what I'm going to do is just take you through each of these different steps just for a couple of minutes per, and then we'll close up with a couple of final slides before we get into lunch. So the first step, creating a clear mission statement. What's our purpose for doing workforce analytics and workforce planning? Like almost any other program you're involved in, could you say, if someone said to you, give me the 15 or 30-second pitch on what this is, what the goal is, and why I should care about it? It's not easy to do with any program, let alone something that's completely new and, as we've talked about in some cases, quite a nebulous topic. So what's the mission statement? What are the drivers? Why are we doing this? Having, as we see here, almost on a piece of paper, just a one-page document, why are we doing this? How does this tie into what the business is doing? What kind of HR transformation we may be going through? What major issues we've had with the workforce in the past couple of years? What our growth plan might be? So what are the drivers of this? And then what are some of the specific next steps we have in place? So I like the idea of just creating a very simple 15, 20-word mission statement that everybody understands and that we reinforce time and time again. So we build some consistency. Darren talked about the branding of reports. Zenith puts its brand. This is a workforce analytics team report. This data is correct. You can trust it. It's gone through the process we need to put it through to be good quality data. It's a little bit like the same thing with the mission statement. Does everybody know exactly what the mission, the standard goal of this function might be? So if you haven't done this already, as you hear different stakeholders, so different presenters talk later today, kind of think through what was their mission statement. If they were to summarize what they're doing in 30 seconds, can they do that? And how do we link that back to what either the business is doing or HR is seeking to doing or what we're seeing within our workforce? So the stakeholders and the champions. Stakeholders being formal, people accountable for the success of the program. It's part of their job, it's part of their career plan, it's part of their MBOs. The champions, informal, people who will support the program, people who love data, who love internal consulting, who want to share the results and broadcast it out. So ultimately, we are going to need some stakeholders because we need money from somewhere and we need official support. But how do we find people around the organization that firstly may be doing this already? And in workforce planning, you'll often find that there's somebody, even if you're not doing enterprise-wide workforce planning, there's somebody in the organization doing this somewhere. Every major company has to have those people. How do we find them and bring them together because they're passionate about what we do? They can spread the message. They can go to town halls and talk about the wins they've had in using data. So who are the stakeholders? Who has formal accountability for this? And then who are our champions now? And in many cases, as we bring them in over time, we make sure we co-opt them into this program. So how do we identify some of the issues for analysis? Darren's talked a little bit about this already. What we see often, firstly there is the ideal state. This is a top-down request. We need to increase revenue by X% next year. Here's the kind of workforce issue we need to investigate. Here's the kind of workforce plan we need to put together. There's a clear link to a corporate strategy, a functional strategy, a human capital strategy. When it happens, it's fantastic. In reality, what you see is on the bottom-up approach. I get lots and lots of requests for information. And we have to balance the two. With a lot of requests that come in, it's just a simple statement. I need a list of X. We don't have the opportunity necessarily to go and ask them, why do you need this? What are you going to use it for? What's the decision or the case you're thinking about in your mind? And maybe you're not looking for this kind of data, you're looking for something else. But ultimately, we're trying to understand, is there a business case for me spending my time? And there's a really good story from one of our former members, Reagan Klein at HealthNet. Reagan was a one-person team just starting to build a workforce analytics program. And she was trying to change the way the requests came in. And she still get a lot of requests coming in for basic data pulls from HRIS. And she said, first of all, we have a team, an HRIS team that's very good at that kind of reporting. If it falls into their world, there's no point me spending my time on it. I'm a workforce analytics expert now. My time is better spent consulting with you. So if the request is something we can do through HRIS team, we send it that way. Otherwise, I'm going to come back to you with 5 or 6 questions. And it's going to take 5 minutes of your time to answer the questions. I appreciate that may be a bit of a burden. But if I'm going to spend the next 2 or 3 days really looking into this issue and coming back with a really impressive set of findings, I need to spend 5 minutes now scoping this topic. And so she'd keep asking, why do you need this? Why do you need this? And keep reacting to the conversation that was taking place. And it really helped to separate, firstly, the transactional reports that went from HRIS to the strategic reports or the workforce analytics, and help really prioritize where does she spend her time. If it's somebody she's talking to who has no idea as to how they're going to use the data, they just always got that report, it's probably going to be a lower priority for her. Maybe something HRIS could do, but there's probably other priorities she went through. Now, you need support for this. You need somebody around you to say, yes, here's how we're going to set this person up. They are going to be the authority for analytics, and they're going to take the lead on this, and we need to support that process. But it's going to mean that we don't spend a lot of time on these very low priority requests that come in. So the fourth decision, when are we going to use this information? I mentioned that people don't want more meetings. You know, we don't have enough time as it is. So are there meetings that take place today, kind of either the monthly strategy review meetings, the quarterly scorecard meetings, the annual kickoff? Are there meetings that take place today where we can either bring in data, or we can at least start to add an agenda item that has some questions? How do we, quote unquote, define key talent? What's our biggest workforce risk in the next 12 months? Which segments of the population are you most concerned about? What assumptions do you have about the workforce that we can potentially test with information because it's impacting the way you manage your organization? So finding those meetings that are already on the docket where we can have those conversations or bring data versus having to create a whole flotilla of new meetings. NSTAR was one company that rolled out a very simple workforce reporting process. They already had a meeting between the head of HR and the CEO that talked about talent management topics, that they just started to push some reports. They had some simple reports on acquiring, developing, and retaining talent. And those reports now are included as part of that meeting. And then following on from that, the employee relations staff, who were the first group of people they wanted to do workforce analytics, they already had their own internal staff meeting. Those same reports now came down to the employee relations team. They got to review them as well, got to ask questions about them. So all of this discussion around acquiring, retaining, developing employees is all taking place within existing meetings. No new resources were needed to be able to do this. Just a very easy way for them to gain acceptance. They didn't get the rolling of the eyes when you saw that 2-hour meeting go on your calendar for a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon. We already have the meetings. We already talk about these kinds of topics. Now let's bring some data in and have us change the way we have a conversation about these numbers. So as you think about your own calendars, all the meetings you go to, your colleagues go to, are there opportunities to bring in some metrics or even just ask the questions, the risks, the costs, the segments we're concerned about, the definition of key talent? The 100 questions that Darren has copies of is a great resource for having that kind of discussion. So fifth decision, determining the data analysis model. So separate from the people that are going to do this work, what's our model? What's our organizational structure for this? And we've typically seen 3 main approaches. I mean, every company is certainly very different, but 3 main approaches to this. First of all, is having the HR business partner do more of this work. They know the business. They're closely tied to what end users may want. They support P&Ls. A good audience in that respect. They're bridging the gap between HR and the rest of the business. Problem is, in many cases, there's a good number of them. It's hard to train them all. Some like data, some do not. We did a survey for one firm, and the business partner who supports the finance function, as you might expect, loves data. Happy to see more data coming her way. Others perhaps less so. So HR business partners are often, they're certainly critical people to have as part of this process, but may not be the right kinds of people to actually lead this effort. There may be too many of them, they may be very decentralized, they may have other responsibilities as well. So first is, do we get HR business partners, even HR generalists involved in this process? Second might be, do we take people who do workforce reporting, data management, HRIS staff, and ask them to do this kind of work? In some respects, it makes sense. They own systems. They see data in our ERPs. They know numbers to a certain point. That's great. But in other cases, they're very far removed from the rest of the business. They're not having the same kinds of conversations that an HR business partner has, for example. And again, may require real detailed efforts to bring them together on a regular basis, not just to get them started and to train them, but to keep building the reps, give them more opportunities to do analysis. It's certainly been done before, and you certainly see when we look at that measurement spectrum on the left-hand side, moving from bucket 1 to bucket 2, it's often the HRIS staff that get more involved in strategic workforce reporting. But as you move further up the scale, what you tend to see is more of an analytics center of excellence. Some companies I know have 20 people. Other companies, it's just half an FTE. We talked earlier this morning about the challenges in being key person dependent. And if you have the one person that does all of this and they walk out the door, what happens to the program? So we have to really think through the risks of having all of that capability invested in 1 or 2 people. And when we get to the skills, we give some other examples of that. But a center of excellence, a workforce analytics function or person or group, They're responsible and held accountable for this work. It's not something that is a 5 p.m. on a Friday effort, but they are responsible for doing this kind of work. They are a dedicated resource for this. You know, if it's a small team, it's way easier to train them and give them opportunities to have conversations, and they can then network with people who know the data the best, or who know the business the best, or who know finance the best. So it's not just, it's this team and only this team, but it's small enough where they can then potentially build their network and bring in the kinds of skills and capabilities they don't have kind of within their team. So think critically about what kind of structure we need for this. How are we going to be successful? Are we going to be realistic? You know, if we ask our generalists to do work at the end of the day on go and analyze my employee engagement scores, how likely is that to happen? And are we setting these people up for failure? So we have a structure. We think we have a model that's going to set ourselves up for success based on the place that we are in the maturity model and where we want to be in the next 12 months. We've identified hopefully some people to be part of this group, but now we're thinking about what kinds of skills do we need. And this is a slide I've presented for years and get lots of feedback on, so always happy to take ideas. It's a very simplistic view as to the kinds of skills, attributes, and experiences that an optimal person who's doing workforce analytics and planning may have. So in the blue there, some of the skills, you know, HR and business basics. More so now, business knowledge, perhaps than HR process knowledge. Quant skills, you know, ability to understand basic data, understand statistics, understand correlation, causation, maybe build some models as well. Consulting skills. To the example I gave of Reagan at HealthNet, asking questions about end users on why they want the data. Helping understand how to take this very big issue and do root cause analysis on it to get down to some very small, testable hypotheses. And then communication skills. What's often overlooked in all of this effort to run the numbers is to think about how best to communicate them. Darren talked about visualizations, about storyboards, drawing conclusions, suggesting next steps. But whether it's in person, whether it's through PowerPoint or Excel, do they have the skills to be able to craft a story, like we saw at the very outset of this morning, craft a story that helps an executive understand what the data means. In terms of attributes, natural curiosity, the whole skill versus will. Do they have an interest in doing this kind of work? Some people do, some people don't, and that's fair. But are they going to be excited about this? Are they going to be passionate? Will they help find champions around the rest of the firm that can be supportive of this effort? Are they able to think on their feet? The example I gave of doing the presentation where everybody slammed the graphics. Are they able to react to that and have a good discussion about where they're going to move next? You know, the pressure of making those kinds of presentations, certainly for the first time, is very great. So are they able to walk in there with a confident manner and be able to think quickly when they get questions about data credibility, or why do I care, or what time is lunch? Is there some level of experience or tenure? It's a hard thing to get unless you have it. But who in the organization's had experience in working in HR or running numbers or thinking through internal consulting projects, someone with a bit of experience in this field? And then do they have access? Ultimately, this can't happen in a vacuum, and the danger is with some of the models, these people are so decentralized, so siloed, that they just don't have the access to the people who need to make the decisions based on these numbers. So let me ask, are there obvious skills, attributes, experiences that you've seen or that you've heard of, or that are missing from this slide? Again, very simplistic view of this, and it is hard to find people with all of these. If you are one of those people, your skills are going to be in such high demand in the next few years. Love to have your business card. But are there things that are missing off here? You say, in our organization, we need people with this kind of skill to do analytics and planning. People who drive cultural change or understand it and react to it? Both?
Understand it, can drive it,
Mm-hmm.
can move leaders through the process of moving to a more analytical-based decision-making process.
To what extent would you expect that skill to be in same demand for the stakeholders, someone who has a formal, accountable responsibility for this program? They should certainly have it. Do you see in equal portions for this kind of person who's doing the work as well?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes. Because they need to understand the nuances of the process of how you move stakeholders from one point to another. How do you move them to actualizing the use of this data in their business?
Yep.
You know, how do you help them to use this data, these techniques in decision making? Understanding how, helping them understand how it's going to impact their business, the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
You know, cultural change.
That's a great point. So being able to drive change and also be aware of change and how to react to it and how to take the current culture and also the future culture and bring that into your program. Great, thank you. Any other perspectives, other skills, attributes?
One thing we've seen is it seems to work well is for companies to bring somebody within their organization that may have a Six Sigma background from some other part of the organization, whether it be manufacturing, distribution, whatever, and bring them over into the HR organization. Because in many cases, with that Six Sigma background, they learn a lot of things you're talking about, how to get people to think differently, but they also have some self-confidence. The fact they've done it before, I think that's one of the things that holds back from the HR analytical side is that because there's not a lot of success stories,
Mm-hmm.
that people don't have that self-confidence to say, no, I know this works, I just got to show it. So I think using Six Sigma background people helps.
Yeah, the process experience they've had is great for this because, as we've talked about, workforce planning is more of a process. There is a clear set of steps in all this. Analytics could be all over the place if we don't put some structure around it, and people with those kinds of skill sets are very good at looking at a process. Across here?
This is not exactly what you asked, but it builds on a couple of responses. Here's my question for you. I can see easily how a lot of the business people that you would bring this to do respond very favorably, because it's turning HR much more into a core part of business, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the other hand, you didn't address this directly, but I'm just curious what the key learnings might be. I can think of a few senior VPs of HR that I know who would see what you're bringing to the table potentially as risky or threatening to them. So I'm just curious in their role. Curious what you've learned all
Mm-hmm.
the time in terms of what helps you to quote unquote position or sell what you're doing to those folks.
Yeah, I'll break them down into two camps. There is the senior leader outside of HR and the senior leader inside of HR. For the ones outside of HR, the first strategy, frankly, is to avoid. Go and find other people, other leaders that do have support for this. And we're not expecting people to take it at face value and throw their support behind it without any kind of results. But particularly when it comes to workforce planning, the best success we've had is engaging other leaders when we talk about their business. We know enough about your business drivers for the next few years, your competitive threats, your workforce, to be able to make some recommendations about how you think about workforce planning. And through that, we get the engagement of other leaders, the benefits of that being then able to go to the resistant leader and illustrate what's happening elsewhere. I think most organizations are incredibly competitive. One business leader does not want to be outshone by somebody else that's making a real difference. So for the outside of HR business leader, it tends to be it's almost the judo strategy of sort of avoid them, circle around them, find some support elsewhere, and then use that to get some wins. If it's the inside of HR, VP, SVP, that just doesn't buy into this whatsoever, I think that's frankly incredibly difficult. I think it's very hard to make people change their minds in a very short space of time, and frankly that's then a question about, is this the right kind of firm for me? Based on, if I have these kinds of capabilities, there's a big enough market for me. Not to sound defeatist, but it is very hard to change somebody. And someone in that role who in theory should be open to this, if they're not, it's going to be very hard to make the case. I think showing best practices, doing some off the side of the plate work, just to do some basic analysis around even just looking at employee engagement scores and turnover scores and performance scores and picking a population and looking at those three to see are there any relationships, I would hope gives you the opportunity to have a more detailed conversation. But if you go through that step and it doesn't materialize, it's hard to do.
It's a red light.
It's a massive red light. I'd love to say in a perfect world, well, you just show them the numbers and they're going to go, wow, this is the best thing since sliced bread. In reality, if it's not their thing, it's going to be hard to make that change. Okay, so 3 more steps. Darren talked a little bit about this already. So the segmentation. We talked about the producers, people who are actually going to get the data out of the technologies, out of the spreadsheets, off the Word documents, out of people's heads. They're going to prepare, package, distribute that information. But then who's going to get it, and what are they going to start asking about? And this is really, I suppose, a little bit of the cultural understanding. What have they seen in the past in some cases? How might they react to this kind of data? There was a former colleague of ours who ran a center of excellence at a communications firm who would present new workforce data in his own fancy charts. And he's a lot smarter than I was, so he could actually understand the charts. But he went to the operations team and presented the data, and they said, well, that's just not how we look at numbers. And we now need to spend time figuring out what your charts mean. Can't you just use the same charts we use? And then we accept them, we're fine with them, we understand them. Now you can spend your time delivering the message to us and not trying to convince us why this chart might be better. But what are the major risks and issues they face? How do they approach data? How do they approach their workforce? What assumptions do they have? We talked about that a little bit this morning. If they look at these numbers and go, you know what, we've always had low turnover, high number of low performers. Are they going to keep coming back with that same issue? At some point, we've got to address it and hopefully disprove it and move on to something else. So what are the main issues? What are their fears? What are they held accountable for? And how do they view data today? Are they like the operations team that already has a set of standards that we need to better conform our program to? I'm not going to dwell on communication plan. I think we're all probably been hit over the head an awful lot with communication. But overall, how do we best share this message? Email's great for some vehicles, town halls for other, social networking now that we see, these different technologies. But how do we make sure that the key stakeholders are well informed and that they in turn share with their staff? How do we give champions the opportunity to spread the message to other people that might buy into this program? How do we make sure people are clear that we have an overarching mission for all of this? What are our next steps? So, deciding whatever the right kinds of communication vehicles are in your organization to get this message out. And keep communicating. Share the quick wins, share the good stories, share the feedback, share the emails. Aetna, I've mentioned Aetna is one of my clients. They do a really good job of any time the report goes out every month, they have a number of reports. Any feedback that gets brought in gets sent back to the Center of Excellence team, gets documented, gets kept, so they know that people are actually looking at the numbers and providing good feedback to them. And then finally, probably one of the hardest things on here is to think about what are the kinds of metrics we want to use to measure the success of this. I gave the example of Mike Molinaro at Comcast, who says it's less about ROI, it's more about an X-ray tool to diagnose where our problems might be and then make the right kinds of decisions following that point. But are there a set of input metrics about just number of reports produced, number of training sessions held, output metrics, people using the data, how many people have viewed a report online or been to the dashboard. But ultimately, we're trying to get to the kinds of metrics that Dr. Jack and many others talk about there. What's the impact metric? What's the decision that we made differently based off these numbers? What cost did we avoid because we didn't give everybody a pay raise, but instead picked this segment based off the data to give a pay raise and also think about internal career paths for, because that seemed to be the right solution to the problem based on the analysis that we did. So I think it's hard to come up with that overarching ROI. There certainly should be some financial metrics there. Revenues generated, dollars saved. But what are the other kinds of impact metrics we have for workforce analytics? So 2 final points. I think bringing all of that together, we need to set some priorities. What are our strengths? What are we good at today? What are the weaknesses? We mentioned before this morning, data credibility may be a weakness, should be a priority for us. What are some of the opportunities? Based on the 100 questions, we know that we want to look at this issue of workforce planning. That should be a first priority. And what are some of the threats? If we have that one person that runs this program, if they leave, what happens? So if that's going to be a threat, we need to build a succession program to potentially replace them and give others exposure to the work that they do. So taking all of these decisions, writing down all of the potential options, and as you start to make decisions, put together a bit of a SWOT just to think through what happens now, what are the strengths that we communicate as part of our first set of communications, what are the weaknesses we start to address now, opportunities and threats, where do we look at these in the next 6 to 12 months and figure out where they're actually taking place. So the last image I'll leave you with, I suppose, is to try and wrap this all together, is to try and keep it simple. And I'm not suggesting those decisions are simple ones to make. They're not easy, they don't operate in a vacuum. But can we keep this simple? And the way I think about workforce analytics and workforce metrics is one of my favorite films in the last 25 years. And I want to leave you with this graphic because I think it just sums up what we're trying to do here. Snakes on a plane. Anybody not seen Snakes on a Plane? Okay. If you haven't seen it, can you give me any sense as to what the plot is? There are some snakes. There's a plane. If we don't get off the plane, bad things will happen. It's a rather ridiculous analogy, but I think it works well for me in terms of how I think about workforce analytics. Ultimately, we're trying to create a very simple message, a simple plot, such that if you're the first person to have a conversation with me about workforce analytics, or you've never heard of workforce analytics, you've never seen that movie, you know what you should be asking. You know what we're expecting of you. There's a very simple message that comes out of our workforce analytics program. And so it's an odd example, and I hope you don't just leave thinking of snakes on a plane, but that's what we're trying to get to, something that is so simple that when I say snakes on a plane, everybody in this audience knows. If I was to do the same thing in your company, and I talked about workforce analytics, I want everybody to go, yeah, I know what analytics is. I know what our mission is. I know who the best practice companies are. I know how we translate workforce data into financial data. I know how to get the support of the senior executives. All of these steps in the process, that's what we're trying to accomplish with the program, and keeping it as simple as possible and reinforcing that hopefully will increase the likelihood that we get these programs off the ground, firstly, and that secondly, we're successful in the years to come. That's it at this point from me. Any questions in terms of building a capability for this, making decisions, steps to follow, and otherwise I have a couple of concluding thoughts. Well, the concluding thoughts then. Firstly, thank you. You spent 3 hours with Darren and myself this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk here today. I would suggest that if you do want to copy the slides, the best way to get them is just to send me an email. So I have some cards here, or you can drop off a card. We'd love to keep in contact with you as well. So if you can drop off a card or take one of mine, we can get you a copy of the slides. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy the rest of the 2 days here. There's a wealth of experience around you, not just the presenters, but everybody here at the table. So use the time to network with each other, and otherwise enjoy the rest of the conference and have a safe journey home. Thank you.